My parents threw me out for being too sick, but what my brother did in secret changed everything. The last time I stood inside my parents' Portland home, the light was dim with December fog curling at the edges of the windows, and my father couldn't even look me in the eye. My mother had already packed my bag without asking. She left it by the door like a subtle reminder I was no longer welcome. 1 month earlier, I'd collapsed during a live event for our family business. Bilson Wellness, a company built on clean living, emotional balance, and curated perfection. The irony was sharp, because while the public believed I was the radiant face of a rising health empire, my immune system was falling apart in private. My name is Rachel Bilson. I'm 30 years old. For most of my life, I believed I was valued, respected, and loved within the walls of our company and our family. But chronic illness changes everything. Slowly. Then all at once. I was diagnosed with a rare autoimmune disorder earlier that year. It began subtly migraines that left me speechless during meetings, bruises with no explanation, fevers that lingered for weeks, when doctors couldn't identify the root cause. My mother insisted I stop seeing specialists and try one of our in-house detox regimens. My father, Daniel Bilson, doubled down on the PR strategy, calling my condition seasonal burnout in interviews while quietly removing me from product campaigns. I tried to believe them, just like I always had. But when my legs gave out on stage in front of 600 conference attendees, the truth refused to be ignored. They called an ambulance. Then they called a lawyer. I was still recovering when they brought me into a meeting and handed me a letter from our board. The language was polished, distant, effective immediately. I was removed from all decision-making roles for health-related impairment. My office had been emptied, my company email deactivated when I returned home. My mother didn't ask how I was feeling. She told me to rest, but not for too long. There was a wellness retreat in Tahoe in 3 weeks, and I was still expected to present. I laughed, then I cried. Then I realized she wasn't joking. The next day, I woke up to my phone wiped clean, my bank card declined, and a silent message waiting in the form of a manila envelope on the counter. Inside were medical records, some signed without my knowledge, and a one-way ticket to a healing institute I'd never heard of, located in Montana. I asked my mother what it meant. She said, "We're doing what's best for everyone now." My father stood behind her, arms crossed, jaw locked. That was the last time I looked at them with anything resembling trust. They drove me out of town the next morning. I didn't argue. I was too tired, and part of me thought maybe this center would help. The car was silent the whole way, somewhere outside of Sisters, Oregon. My father turned off the main highway and onto a gravel road. When we stopped, there was no building, no retreat, no staff in white coats waiting with kind smiles. Just an abandoned service station covered in ivy, a faded gas price sign from the 90s, and a bench with one broken slat. My mother opened the trunk. My backpack was inside. So was a sealed envelope with a discharge form I'd never signed. They told me to wait there, that someone would pick me up soon. I said nothing. I think part of me still hoped this was a test, or a mistake, or some cruel wellness-themed intervention. But when their taillights disappeared into the trees, I understood exactly what had happened. They hadn't sent me away. They had thrown me out. For hours, I sat on that bench while the wind picked up and the temperature dropped. My phone had no signal. My wallet was empty except for expired business cards and a cracked driver's license. I couldn't walk far without pain. Every joint felt like it was filled with glass. But what hurt most wasn't physical. It was realizing the people who raised me, who trained me to smile on cue and speak in brand-aligned slogans, had decided I was no longer useful, not just to the company, but to them. I was a liability they couldn't market anymore, a flaw in their perfect image, a cost they were no longer willing to carry. That night, as the first snow began to fall and the road disappeared into white silence, I wrapped myself in the emergency foil blanket my mother had left in the side pocket of the bag. For all her cruelty, she never forgot the optics. Even exile came with accessories. I thought I was going to die there. I was almost ready to. But sometime before midnight, a truck pulled up. The window rolled down. A familiar voice said my name. The voice that called my name didn't belong to a stranger. It had the same quiet steadiness I remembered from childhood, the same way of holding a word like, it might break if said too loud. I turned toward the sound and saw a man step out of the truck, tall and lean, wrapped in an old canvas jacket and snow-dusted jeans. His beard was thicker than I'd ever seen and his hair longer. But the moment he knelt beside me, I saw his eyes, Tyler, my brother, my ghost. He had disappeared when I was 19, right after a closed-door argument with our father that ended in slamming doors and months of silence. Back then, I was too deep inside the family system to question what they told me. That he had chosen failure, that he didn't believe in the company anymore, that he'd run away to avoid responsibility. I believed them because I needed to, because the truth would have cost too much. Now, looking into his eyes under falling snow, I knew none of it had been true. He helped me into the truck without saying much. The heat was on, and the seats were warm, like he'd been driving for hours just to find me. I couldn't stop shaking, not just from cold, but from everything breaking at once inside me. He handed me a thermos of tea, the exact brand I used to steal from his cabinet when we were kids. I didn't ask how he'd known where I was. He didn't offer the answer right away. We drove in silence for a long time, winding deeper into the mountain roads until the lights of town had completely disappeared. The place he brought me to wasn't a hospital or a safe house. It was a cabin hand-built, remote, and somehow still alive in the middle of the forest. There was a wood stove burning steady, quilts on every surface, and a faint smell of lavender and cedar. He helped me out of the truck, carrying my bag in one hand and holding my elbow with the other. I was too tired to argue, too sore to resist, and too confused to speak. Once inside, he gave me dry clothes and stepped outside while I changed. I sank into the worn couch like I'd been living there for years. When he came back in, he handed me soup and sat across the room without speaking. The only sound was the stove cracking and the storm outside. Eventually, I asked the only thing that mattered. How did you know? He didn't look up right away. When he did, his face was unreadable. I've been watching them for a while, he said. I saw the retreat papers. I knew they were planning something. I just didn't know it would be this. I asked if he'd been following me. He said no, he'd been watching them. That night, I slept more deeply than I had in months. No painkillers, no humidifier, no Bluetooth sleep therapy. Just a warm blanket, a solid roof, and the quiet breath of someone who hadn't left me behind. When I woke, he was outside chopping wood, and for a moment I watched through the frosted window, trying to remember when we'd last been in the same place without tension or lies. He came in with snow on his shoulders and asked if I was hungry. I nodded. The words still felt fragile. Over the next few days, I began to understand what Tyler had built. The cabin was part of a larger off-grid property, solar-powered, insulated with natural materials, and stocked with months of supplies. He'd created a place that didn't need outside validation or PR or glossy logos. It just worked. He told me he'd lived in Denver for a while, worked construction, met an old vet named Frank who taught him how to live like this. Frank had passed, but Tyler kept the lessons. He showed me the greenhouse he built by hand, the small radio system he used to pick up news, the notebook where he tracked weather patterns like it was a form of prayer. Eventually, I asked him why he left, the real reason, not the version our parents told the media or the one I'd quietly believed. He said it started with my blood test. I was 15 when my health began declining, and Tyler, who had a background in molecular bioengineering, recognized some of the markers as consistent with long-term exposure to experimental compounds. He confronted my father, suggested I be taken out of the company trial program and sent to Boston for independent care. My father refused. My mother backed him. The company image came first. Tyler threatened to go public. He was kicked out that night. He tried to find me. He said, sent letters, made calls, but they cut off every path, changed schools, blocked numbers, told the staff I'd had a breakdown and needed space for years. He thought I'd been brainwashed. Then he realized they'd just cut me off slowly, wrapped in silk and silence, until I couldn't remember what freedom looked like. Now, sitting across from him, I realized he wasn't here to rescue me. He was here to offer something harder, a mirror, a map, a choice. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure if I was ready to see where it led. A week passed before I asked about the leather journal sitting untouched on the shelf near the stove. Tyler hesitated when I pointed to it, then walked over slowly and placed it in my hands like something too old or too dangerous to speak of. It belonged to our mother, he said quietly, then stepped back and let me decide whether I wanted to open it. The cover was cracked from use. The pages filled with a slanted handwriting I recognized from birthday cards and school notes. But here, her words were unfiltered, unpolished, written in the voice of a woman I never got to meet, the one who existed behind the smiling press interviews and cruelty dressed up as strength. I read in silence for hours. The entries began just after I was born, full of mundane details about feeding schedules and sleep patterns, then shifted over time into something colder, something harder. She wrote about how tired she was, how the company was bleeding money, how my condition might be the opportunity they needed. Then came a name I didn't recognize, Neurovascin, a biotech firm specializing in pediatric neurological trials. According to the journal, my parents signed a strategic partnership with the company when I was barely 3 years old. They agreed to have me enrolled in an early-stage trial in exchange for funding and stock at the time. She wrote, "It felt like a solution. Then the side effects started." She described my symptoms in clinical terms, as if distancing herself from the child those words belonged to. The bruises, the fevers, the tremors, the nights I couldn't sleep from pain. She wrote that I was resilient, like I was a machine being tested, not a daughter who cried in her arms. I showed the journal to Tyler that night without saying a word. He read the entries slowly, his mouth tight, jaw clenched. Then he stood and walked out into the snow without a coat. I didn't follow. Some silence deserves to be private. When he returned, he sat across from me and asked if I wanted to know what he'd found in the storage unit. I said yes. He pulled out a box from under the floorboards, filled with printed emails, internal memos, and bank records. They weren't just part of a research partnership. Our parents had been receiving quarterly payments tied to my test milestones. The worse I got, the more they were paid. There were signatures, timestamps, contracts, no ambiguity, no misunderstanding, no way to pretend it hadn't happened. I wasn't just a daughter. I was a revenue stream. I wanted to scream, but there was no space for that here. The forest outside felt too still, too sacred. Instead, I whispered the truth to myself again and again until the weight of it became familiar. My parents threw me out for being too sick, but they had made me sick. The damage wasn't accidental. It was chosen. I started connecting the dots backward. The doctors who suddenly stopped returning calls, the supplements they insisted I take without question, the unexplained injections during routine scans as a child. All the times I thought I was being helped, I was being harvested. And the worst part, the entire wellness empire had been built on top of it. The clean lifestyle, the miracle retreats, the testimonials, they were a mask for what started with me. I wasn't just erased from the brand, I was its foundation, and no one was supposed to know. Tyler told me he had already started compiling a file. He'd been collecting evidence for years, waiting for a chance to bring it forward. But the legal system was slow, and without a living victim willing to speak, everything could be dismissed as speculation. Now that I was out and conscious and old enough to make decisions, things could change. But he warned me. They would fight back. Hard. He'd seen what happened to other whistleblowers in the space harassment, intimidation, planted stories. It would get ugly. He asked if I was ready. I said no, but I would be. Later that night, a car passed by the property, slow, with no lights. Tyler turned off every visible source of electricity and pulled me away from the windows. The next morning, we found tire marks near the gate. A paper envelope had been left inside the mailbox. No postage, no name, just one line printed on plain white paper. You were never meant to survive. Stop digging. My hands shook, but I didn't cry. I looked at the paper, then at the stack of files Tyler had organized, then at the journal lying open on the table beside my tea. I remembered how many times I had trusted that same handwriting, and then I folded the note in half and placed it on top of the evidence pile. They had built their brand on the story of a miracle family, but the miracle was me. I had survived what they couldn't even admit, and now I had nothing left to lose. 3 days after the note arrived, I collapsed during a physical therapy session. My muscles locked up without warning, and I hit the ground before I could brace myself. Tyler rushed in, but I waved him off. Anna was already there, the quiet combat medic who visited twice a week to help me regain strength. She didn't flinch, didn't ask if I was okay. She knelt beside me and told me to breathe through the pain. The tremors would pass. The fear would take longer. As I lay on the floor, my fists clenched and my chest heaving, I realized I wasn't angry about the fall. I was angry that I still needed permission to fight. For so long, I had waited for someone else to fix it, to explain it, to justify what had been done. But no one was coming, not anymore. That afternoon, I asked Tyler to show me how to use the secure system in the hidden basement, a small concrete room beneath the greenhouse disguised as a root cellar. He gave me access to encrypted files, taught me how to use the offline archive, and sat silently as I started piecing together a story no one was supposed to read. Every withdrawal from the medical fund had a date and a signature. Every company shipment carried the same research tag. Every news article we'd paid to bury had a digital footprint. What disturbed me most were the email chains between my parents and the pharmaceutical company. They weren't just complicit, They were strategic. They discussed managing media narratives, exploiting my health in private while denying it in public, and referring to me in third person as the primary trial case. I wasn't their daughter in those conversations. I was a liability they thought they had under control. Each night, I wrote entries in the back of my mother's journal, not to forgive her, but to place my truth beside hers. I didn't know what justice would look like, but I knew silence could no longer be part of it. On the 6th day, Anna brought news. She had tracked down a former researcher from Neurovasan who had resigned 3 years earlier under suspicious circumstances. Her name was Dr. Lenora Kim. She now taught at a community college across the state and lived under a different surname. When Anna reached out, Dr. Kim hesitated, but when she heard my name and my symptoms, she agreed to meet. There was one condition: no phones, no location sharing, no cameras. She would choose the meeting spot and time. The next morning, Tyler spotted a dark SUV parked on the ridge road that circled the property. 2 men in suits, no local plates, no visible IDs. The same sedan had passed twice the night before. We didn't wait to find out more. Tyler packed a go bag and told me he would draw them away. He knew the back roads better than anyone and could stay invisible for days if needed. Anna and I would meet Dr. Kim at the designated point, a picnic area near a state park, with enough public access to feel safe, but remote enough to buy us time. Before Tyler left, he placed a worn flash drive in my hand. It contained copies of every document, every photo, every trace of what had been done. If something happened, I was to go public immediately. His eyes didn't flinch when he said it. He trusted me to carry what he had been building in the shadows. As his truck disappeared down the trail, a strange calm settled over me. I wasn't running anymore. I was walking into something clear, even if I didn't know what it would become. We reached the meeting spot by mid-afternoon. Dr. Kim was already there, seated at a weathered table with her hands folded tightly in her lap. She was smaller than I expected, with nervous eyes that darted toward every sound in the trees. When I sat down, she looked at my wrists and then my eyes, as if confirming something from memory. "Phase 3, she whispered. Not as a question, but a recognition. I nodded. Her voice trembled when she spoke next. "You shouldn't be alive." Then she opened her bag and pulled out a small brown folder with names, dosages, protocols, and risk acknowledgments signed by people I thought I once knew. Her hands were shaking. "I kept this," she said, "because no one else would." As we drove back through the forest, I stared at the folder in my lap. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like light after too much darkness. Proof that I wasn't imagining it, that I hadn't made it up, that someone outside the family, outside the company, had seen it, too. That night, I opened the last page of my journal and wrote a sentence I never thought I'd be able to write. I am not what they made me, and I'm not finished yet. We arrived back at the cabin just before sunset, the sky stained with the kind of orange that makes everything feel both calm and temporary. Tyler wasn't back yet, but his truck had returned, parked in the shade near the greenhouse. There was no note, no sound, just the faint smell of wood smoke and something else underneath it, like engine grease and metal. Anna scanned the perimeter without saying a word while I checked the motion cameras he'd set up along the tree line. Nothing unusual had been captured, nothing out of place, and that was what made us nervous. By nightfall, the electricity blinked twice before cutting out completely. The backup system clicked on instantly, but something felt wrong. When I turned on the security monitor, one of the cameras had been disabled. Anna moved quickly, locking the outer doors and checking the basement hatch. She didn't panic. She'd seen worse in war zones. I hadn't. I kept staring at the monitor, even though I knew it wouldn't show me what I feared. A few minutes later, we found the envelope slipped under the cabin door. Same white paper, same typed font. This time it said, "You have one chance to stay silent. Use it." It wasn't just a warning. It was a deadline. Anna pulled out her phone to call the lawyer, but the line went straight to voicemail. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat at the kitchen table with the folder from Dr. Kim spread out in front of me, reading every word again, as if repetition would make it hurt less. But it didn't. I kept thinking about the other children she mentioned, the ones who hadn't survived, the ones whose stories would never be told. I thought about how close I had come to becoming one of them, and how my parents had chosen wealth and influence over every instinct that should have told them to protect me. I remembered how many times they had looked into cameras and said we were a resilient family rooted in trust. I remembered how they framed me leaving the company as a mutual decision based on Rachel's journey to personal healing. I remembered every press release, every photo shoot, every staged family moment, now covered in the dust of their betrayal. At sunrise, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number. 5 words. "He's in custody. Don't come." No punctuation. No signature. Just enough to twist my stomach. Anna and I decoded the message fast. Tyler had been arrested. They were using false charges, probably trespassing or tampering or something vague but effective. I wanted to run straight to the sheriff's office, to demand answers, to make noise, but Anna stopped me. They were counting on that. They wanted me to react, to be reckless, to put myself back in the spotlight too early. So we did something they wouldn't expect. We went to the storage unit. It was hidden behind an old gas station just off the highway, the kind of place no one looks at twice. I used the key Tyler left me, taped beneath the third rock by the north corner, exactly where he said it would be, inside. There were boxes stacked by year, labeled in his handwriting. Each one held proof, medical invoices, settlement offers quietly declined, digital backups of internal documents, and most damning of all, a signed agreement between Bilson Wellness and Neurovasan with my initials listed as subject 03R. At the bottom drawer, tucked into a yellow folder, was a notarized petition for emergency emancipation, already prepped with timestamps, legal affidavits, and witness statements from Dr. Kim and Anna. There were copies of the emails my parents had sent. There were photos of the day they left me on the side of the road. Everything had been prepared for the moment I would need to step forward. That evening, I sat down and wrote my own statement, not a social media post, not a tearful video, just my voice on paper, telling the story the way I remembered it, not the way they'd edited it. I didn't talk about revenge. I talked about consequences. I didn't ask for sympathy. I asked for attention. I wanted them to feel what I had felt for years, not pain, not pity, but exposure. The sharp, bright heat of truth when it no longer hides behind branding and polished lies. I submitted the emancipation request the next morning and sent copies of the contract to a journalist who had once tried to uncover my father's ties to off-label research. Within 12 hours, she called me personally. She said she wanted to tell the whole story. I looked at the last sentence in my mother's journal that night, the one I had avoided reading until now. If she finds this, run. They won't stop until she's gone. She was right, they wouldn't stop, but neither would I. 3 days later, I walked into the green room of a national investigative news program with my hands shaking and my spine stiff with pain. I hadn't seen my reflection in weeks, and the makeup artist startled me when she adjusted the mirror. My face looked different somehow, not just tired, but sharpened by something colder. A year ago, I would have spent hours preparing for this moment, planning my outfit, perfecting the way I'd smile on camera, making sure every sentence landed like a carefully rehearsed brand promise. But now I sat in silence, holding the same folder Tyler had assembled in secret, the one that proved everything they had tried to bury. The producer came in and explained the format. It would be live. There would be questions. I could bring my lawyer if needed. I said no. The only thing I wanted standing beside me was the truth. I could feel the weight of the studio lights even before they turned them on. The host, a seasoned journalist known for her restraint, greeted me politely, her eyes scanning my face the way a doctor reads a scan. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. Then the countdown began. When the cameras started rolling, my heartbeat slowed. I wasn't performing. I wasn't surviving. I was speaking. My name is Rachel Bilson. I am the daughter of Daniel and Margot Bilson, founders of Bilson Wellness. And 3 weeks ago, my parents abandoned me in a remote part of Oregon because they believed I was too sick to be useful. I paused, not for effect, but because the words still felt foreign in my own mouth. They threw me out, I said, not as metaphor, but as fact. They left me on a bench with a backpack and a lie. The host leaned in, asking carefully why I believed they had done it. I didn't speculate. I explained. I told her about the medical fund that had been quietly emptied, about the signature on the treatment protocol I never gave, about the clinical trial I'd never agreed to join, but somehow had been part of since I was 3 years old. Then I handed her the original contract. Her hands shook slightly as she read the company name at the top, Neurovasan Biotech. Her voice changed after that. There was a flicker of anger she didn't bother hiding. She asked what proof I had. I told her I brought copies of internal memos, email trails, patient data logs, and most importantly, a whistleblower willing to testify. I didn't name Dr. Kim yet. I only said the truth wouldn't stay hidden forever. Then came the question I wasn't ready for. She asked what I wanted now. Revenge, legal compensation, public apology. I looked directly into the camera and told the truth. I want visibility. I want every parent who ever considered trading their child's safety for power to see what that cost looks like. I want every victim who was told to stay quiet to know they aren't alone. I want to live without fear that the people who hurt me will get away with it just because they built a business around silence. Then, without warning, I stood up. The doctors had said I might not walk again without support. They were wrong. My legs were shaking. My spine screamed in protest. But I remained upright, every muscle holding on like it knew the world was watching. The host looked shocked. I didn't speak. I let the image say what words couldn't. The girl they tried to erase was standing, not just physically, but symbolically, in front of millions. The interview aired in real time, within minutes. The clip was trending. My name was in headlines again, but this time not as a product of the brand. I wasn't the girl in the background of their empire anymore. I was the story, and the fallout was instant. By nightfall, Bilson Wellness issued a press release claiming they had been misled by a third party. The next morning, their stock dropped 17%. That afternoon, a group of former employees filed an internal ethics complaint. By the end of the week, the Justice Department opened a preliminary investigation into Neurovascin and its associated research partnerships. Tyler was released from custody 2 days later. The charges vanished as quickly as they had appeared. We didn't celebrate. We regrouped. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, we weren't fighting in the dark. I returned to the cabin the following night and stepped out onto the porch alone. The air was cold and clean, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel hunted. I felt seen, somewhere deep in the forest behind me. A sensor light blinked, then faded. I didn't turn around. I simply whispered the sentence that had become my anchor. You threw me out, but I'm still here. I'm still. A week after the broadcast, I received a letter that shouldn't have existed. It came in a plain white envelope with no return address. But the postmark was from a hospice center in Northern California. I sat with it on the table for hours before I opened it. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible in places. But I knew immediately whose it was. My mother's. The same hand that once wrote me birthday cards in pink ink now scrawled words that barely held together. I read the letter once, then again, trying to feel something, trying to understand what she wanted. She wrote that she was dying, lung cancer, too late for treatment. She said she didn't expect forgiveness. She didn't even ask for it. She said my father called everything they did survival. But she now saw it for what it was, greed. She said I had become something stronger than they ever could have imagined, and that I'd always been more than they deserved. There were no excuses, no long apologies, just an ending she didn't want to face in silence. I folded the letter slowly and placed it back in the envelope, not because it hurt too much, but because it didn't change anything. Some bridges aren't burned. They are built with wood already soaked in gasoline. You don't walk back across those. You leave them where they fall. The next morning, I stood at the edge of the property watching as a new sign was installed on the front gate. The words were carved into dark cedar. Simple and clean. Wellspring Foundation for Medical Ethics and Survivor Support. We had changed the name to distance it from the Bilson legacy. Tyler had suggested Wellspring because, as he put it, healing needs a source, a place where something damaged can begin again. The main cabin had been expanded over the past month. What began as Tyler's sanctuary had grown into something much bigger. We now had solar-powered offices, therapy rooms, and private accommodations for survivors and whistleblowers in crisis. Anna left her old clinic job and joined us full-time, leading trauma recovery programs for people who had nowhere else to go. Her story became part of the architecture practical, grounded, quiet strength built into every corner of the space. That afternoon, I helped a boy named Jude with his mobility exercises. He was 12 and had been diagnosed with an aggressive neuroinflammatory condition that mirrored my early symptoms almost exactly. His parents had enrolled him in an experimental study through a local wellness center without fully understanding what it involved. By the time they realized the truth, it was too late. I didn't talk to Jude about my story. He already knew. Everyone who came to Wellspring did. But I told him he wasn't alone, that sometimes surviving was the most radical thing you could do. When he managed to stand without help for nearly a minute, the look on his face told me more than words ever could. Later that night, I walked the perimeter of the property alone, flashlight in hand, not because I was afraid, but because I wanted to feel the boundary of this new life. The trees stood tall and still, unbothered by the past. I paused near the greenhouse where Tyler had first taught me how to grow something from seed. He was inside now, sorting documents for our next round of legal filings. The case against Neurovason had advanced faster than we expected, with Dr. Kim's testimony and the documentation we released. A federal task force had been formed to investigate clinical violations in pediatric trials. It was just the beginning, but the air around it felt real, heavy with possibility. As I reached the main cabin, Anna stepped outside holding a folder of mail. She handed me one letter in particular. Her eyes narrowed. The return address was from a private law firm in Seattle. I opened it without hesitation. Inside was a formal settlement offer from Bilson Wellness. It was generous on paper, 7 figures, no admission of wrongdoing, a full NDA required. I read it once, then calmly handed it back to Anna without a word. She understood. Some things aren't for sale. My silence wasn't one of them. That night, I returned to the page in my mother's journal that started it all. I didn't read her words. I wrote my own underneath them, not to erase her, but to reclaim the space. Then I closed the book and placed it on the shelf where it belonged. A month after the interview aired, we were invited to testify before a federal panel reviewing corporate malpractice in biomedical trials. I wasn't sure I was ready. But when I saw the list of other speakers' parents, nurses, technicians, and even 2 other survivors from the same research phase, I knew silence wasn't an option anymore. The hearing took place in a modest government building with linoleum floors and plastic water pitchers. There were no flashing lights, no journalists in makeup, no studio audiences, just microphones, transcripts, and time limits. And yet it felt heavier than anything I had done before. When they called my name, I walked slowly to the seat, one hand on the cane Tyler had carved for me during my first week in the cabin. I didn't bring notes. I didn't need them. I spoke about what it felt like to be used as a test subject without knowing, to have my body slowly unravel while those responsible smiled on stage and praised holistic wellness. I described being driven into the woods and left alone, not by strangers, but by the people who once promised to protect me. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I just spoke. Across the aisle, I saw representatives from Neurovason taking notes, their faces stiff with strategy. I also saw a woman in the back row holding a framed photo of her daughter who hadn't survived the same trial. Her hands didn't move. Her eyes never left mine. That look stayed with me long after the session ended. After we returned home, the ripple effect grew faster than we anticipated. More victims came forward, many of them afraid at first, then suddenly certain when they realized they weren't alone. Whistleblowers emerged. Former contractors turned over deleted emails. A lab technician anonymously mailed us copies of trial data that showed falsified reports and buried results. We cataloged everything. We encrypted it. Then we released a public archive, fully indexed, open to researchers and legal counsel across the country. We didn't just want accountability, we wanted visibility. The backlash came swiftly, but it wasn't what we feared. Instead of being attacked, we were discredited by implication. Old social media posts were dug up and twisted. Pundits questioned my motives. Former Bilson Wellness executives gave off-record interviews describing me as deeply troubled and emotionally unstable. But this time, it didn't land. The public had seen the footage. They had heard the recordings. They had watched me stand. And no amount of PR spin could undo the image of a girl once discarded. Now, refusing to vanish. 2 weeks later, our lawyer received confirmation that a grand jury had approved formal charges: corporate negligence, fraud, medical abuse of a minor, financial misconduct. It was a start. The day we got the call, Tyler sat beside me on the porch with a mug of coffee he forgot to drink. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he said, quietly, that maybe now. Frank could rest easy. I understood what he meant. Some debts don't get repaid in money or words. They get repaid in what we choose to build from the rubble. We decided not to expand Wellspring further, not yet. We wanted to protect what it had become, a place where people could come when the world had no use for them anymore. We built a scholarship fund. We partnered with 2 research labs to develop ethical oversight protocols for pediatric trials. We added a second greenhouse and named it after Jude, who was now strong enough to run the short trail behind the property without stopping. And sometimes, in the stillness of late night, I would reread the files, not out of pain, but to remember what silence used to sound like before I broke it. One morning, just before autumn, we received a call from a National Museum of Medical Ethics. They wanted to feature our story not as spectacle, but as part of a permanent exhibit on patient consent and institutional failure. I almost said no. Then I thought of the woman with the photo of her daughter, and I said yes. That evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, Tyler asked if I had read the final update from our legal team. I hadn't. He handed me the printed report. At the bottom was a summary line. Margot and Daniel Bilson had pled no contest in exchange for reduced sentencing and permanent industry disqualification. There would be no televised trial, no dramatic courtroom scene, just signatures, fines, and the slow erosion of the legacy they built. 1 year after the day they left me on the side of that road, I stood under the autumn sky and watched Jude laugh as he ran through the garden beds, his shoes muddy, his shirt untucked, his breathing steady. He waved back at me and tripped a little on the edge of the stone path, then caught himself without falling. That small moment, barely noticeable to anyone else, meant everything to me. It was the kind of moment I had never been given at his age, the kind that was stolen quietly and without apology. Tyler stood nearby with a clipboard and a tired smile, checking off deliveries for the new well pump system. His sleeves were rolled, his hands scarred and calloused in a way that told the truth about how hard this place had been built. Wellspring didn't grow because of donations or press coverage or media heat. It grew because we refused to let it die. Every piece of wood, every lifted box, every carefully filtered water line, it was all part of a deeper process neither of us could explain easily. It wasn't therapy, it was repair. Slow, real, unglamorous. That morning, we held our first community roundtable for families with medically traumatized children. The conversations weren't dramatic. No one cried loudly or gave speeches. They passed around tea, traded stories, shared warnings, and asked the kinds of questions no glossy brochure ever answers. Anna led a quiet breathing session at the end. I stayed in the back, mostly listening, only speaking when someone asked about what it felt like to be disbelieved for years. I didn't dramatize it. I said it felt like drowning next to people who insisted the water wasn't real. After everyone left, I found myself alone on the front porch. The leaves had started to fall, and the sound of the wind through them reminded me of that first night Tyler found me, barely conscious, barely whole. I thought about the version of me that used to believe healing meant being perfect again, being strong again, being good enough again. But I had learned that healing meant something quieter. It meant brushing your teeth, even when you couldn't leave bed. It meant answering emails slowly. even if the reply was just not yet. It meant making space for both pain and progress in the same breath. The press didn't come anymore. They'd moved on to louder headlines and newer victims. I didn't miss them. We had kept our commitment not to turn Wellspring into a brand. No glossy logos, no influencer partnerships, no merchandise. Just work, just people, just the hard, daily choice to continue. We weren't trying to save the world. We were trying to give people a place to stop running. That night, Tyler handed me a worn envelope he'd found tucked behind the cabinet in the security office. It had no stamp, no name, just my initials written in blue ink. Inside was a torn piece of notebook paper with a line that stopped me cold. I knew what they were doing. I didn't stop it, but I never looked away. It was signed with one letter, D, my father's handwriting. There was nothing else. No date, no apology, just that single, unfinished confession. I handed it back to Tyler without speaking. I didn't know if it was an attempt at peace or just a final, silent form of control. Either way, it didn't matter anymore. The following morning, we received a message from a hospital in Seattle. A young girl with similar neurological complications had been denied access to a new trial due to legal uncertainties surrounding past ethical failures. Her parents asked if we could help them understand their rights. We didn't hesitate. Anna prepared a packet. Tyler arranged a private call. I sat down and wrote a short note by hand to send with it. You're not alone. Ask every question. Never let them rush you. You are the expert on your child. That line stuck with me long after I wrote it, not because it was profound, but because I finally believed it. I wasn't just someone who survived a scandal. I was someone who had learned what it meant to be in her own body again. I wasn't looking for closure anymore. I wasn't seeking revenge. I wasn't trying to win anything. I was trying to live in a way that no one else had taught me how to. And slowly, almost quietly, I was doing exactly that. The evening before our second annual gathering at Wellspring, I walked alone down the gravel path that curved past the greenhouse, the outer cabins, and finally ended at the ridge overlooking the western valley. I didn't bring my cane. I still used it on long days. But lately, my body had been learning how to carry itself again, slowly, unreliably, but still, mine. The sky was soft with dusk, all lilac and rust-colored haze, and the air smelled of pine sap and wood smoke. Behind me, the property buzzed quietly with preparation, fresh sheets, chairs being arranged, Anna making soup from scratch like she always insisted on during events. It wasn't for presentation. It was ritual. And in some strange way, that mattered more. I reached the edge of the bluff and sat on the same bench where, almost a year ago, Tyler had told me we weren't building a shelter. We were building a mirror, a place for people to see themselves again after the world had spent years erasing them. Back then, I didn't fully understand what he meant. I thought healing was something you completed, like a contract signed and filed away. But now I knew it wasn't linear or dramatic. It was repetitive. It was unglamorous. It was waking up and deciding not to disappear, over and over. That week, a woman named Erin had arrived with her teenage daughter. Both had quiet eyes, tired posture, and carried nothing but a plastic grocery bag filled with photocopied medical charts. No suitcase, no coats, just the unspoken panic of people who had run without planning to. They didn't ask for help. They just asked for time. We gave them a small cabin by the back creek, and for 2 days, no one approached them. Then, slowly, Erin joined one of Anna's support groups. Her daughter started drawing on the whiteboard in the main hall. They stayed longer than we expected. Then they asked if they could volunteer. That's what Wellspring had become. Not a rescue center, a place where people remembered they still had something left to give. I thought about the first few nights I spent here, my body broken, my mind numb, my identity stripped bare. I remembered how angry I was, not just at my parents, but at myself, for having believed for so long that being useful was the same thing as being loved. I remembered the sound of Tyler's voice as he read the file. I wasn't strong enough to open myself. I remembered the weight of that first truth, the one that cracked everything open. And I remembered the silence that followed, not empty, but full of things I would have to name slowly over time. Now, I watched the sun drop lower, bleeding gold across the tree line. In a few minutes, I'd head back to the main house. Guests would begin arriving. Some would recognize me from the interview. Others would know only fragments of the story. I no longer felt the need to correct or explain. I wasn't trying to be an example. I was trying to be present. Tyler would be greeting people at the gate, his sleeves probably rolled up again, his voice calm. Anna would be at the check-in table, correcting a spreadsheet or reminding someone about dinner allergies. Jude would probably be running around barefoot again, chasing the wind like it owed him something. Inside the main hall, I had placed a framed print of the original trial contract, with a line underneath in bold, "No child should ever be consented into silence." It wasn't about me anymore. It was about what this place could outlive. And yet I couldn't ignore what had started it. My parents threw me out. They framed it as survival. They walked away from their daughter and called it clarity. But what they never understood was that in doing so, they created something they couldn't control. They thought they had ended the story, but they were just the first chapter. As the first headlights approached on the distant road, I stood up. My legs were tired, but they held. I walked the trail back toward the house, my footsteps steady, no cameras, no spotlight, just breath, just the quiet rhythm of choosing to stay, even after the world tells you to disappear. And maybe that's the real victory, not in exposing what they did, but in becoming someone they never thought I could be. Someone who didn't just survive being thrown out. Someone who learned to live beyond it. If someone once left you behind because they couldn't carry your weight, ask yourself, was it really you who was too heavy or them who were too weak to hold on?